Incense masked the sour scent of unwashed aristocrats packing the cathedral, a sickly sweet haze clinging to the roof of Rowena's mouth. Heavy velvet stifled her. Corset bones dug brutal half-moons into her bruised ribs. Beside her stood a man she despised, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the bishop. Leaning close, his breath brushed her neck, hot, sharp with clove. "You will beg for mercy," he whispered. Rowena didn't flinch. She smiled, tasting bitten lip. "I've never begged for anything. Parchment always smelled vaguely of vinegar and old bones." Rowena sat at the dining table, one of the 3 pieces of furniture left in the cavernous room, and traced a jagged water stain on the mahogany. The rest of the chairs had been carted away on a Tuesday. The silver went on a Thursday. Her father's pride had vanished long before either, dissolved at the bottom of gin bottles and scattered across felt-topped card tables in London. Footsteps echoed in the empty hall, heavy, unhurried. Not the scuffing, apologetic steps of the remaining scullery maid, but the steady rhythmic impact of leather heels backed by absolute certainty. Dwayne Ashford walked into the room without waiting to be announced. He brought the outside weather in with him, a clinging scent of damp wool, horse sweat, and wet earth. He did not look like a duke. Dukes, in Rowena's limited experience, were soft men who smelled of rose water and wore silk cravats tight enough to strangle their double chins. Dwayne was angular, his face cast in sharp, uncompromising planes. His dark hair was cut short, ruthlessly practical, and a thin white scar pulled at the corner of his left eye, giving him a perpetual, cynical squint. He tossed a leather-bound ledger onto the table. It hit the wood with a flat, final thud. Dust motes danced in the agitated air. "Your father's debts," Dwayne said. His voice was a low rasp, like a shovel scraping stone. "Purchased by me, in their entirety." See, Rowena didn't look at the book. She looked at his hands. They were broad, the knuckles thick, dirt packed beneath the nails of his thumb. A working man's hands sewn onto an aristocrat's wrists. She folded her own hands in her lap, hiding the blisters on her palms from where she had spent the morning trying to salvage the overgrown root vegetables in the manor's neglected garden. "And your terms, Your Grace?" she asked. Her voice was flat. No tremor, no feigned fragility. She knew exactly what he wanted. The Hastings estate bordered his own. Its soil was rich, its timber unlogged, its water pure. It was a jewel her father had been too drunk to mine and too stubborn to sell. "The land," Dwayne said, pulling out the chair opposite her. He sat, the wood groaning in protest under his weight. "The mineral rights, the river access." "You could take them in court," Rowena stated, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were a flat, opaque gray, like slate before a storm. "We cannot afford a solicitor. You would win. Courts take years, appeals take decades. I have investors, shipping lines to build, and a valley to flood for a mill," Dwayne replied, leaning forward. The scent of clove and bitter tobacco drifted off him. "I require the land yesterday. Marriage is instantaneous. It binds the properties irrevocably." He wasn't looking at her like a woman. He was appraising her like a draft horse. Will it pull the plow? Will it survive the winter? "I see," she murmured. She felt a phantom ache in her empty stomach. Her last meal had been a heel of stale bread dipped in salted water. "And what becomes of my father?" "A cottage on my northern estate, a modest stipend, enough gin to kill him by Christmas if he applies himself." Dwayne didn't smile. It was a factual assessment. Rowena swallowed. The click of her throat sounded deafening in the hollow room. She hated her father, pitied him, and mourned the man he used to be, all in equal, exhausting measure. But she wouldn't let him starve in a debtor's prison. "And me?" she asked. Dwayne tilted his head. "You move into Carlisle Hall. You manage the servants. You attend the necessary social obligations without embarrassing me. You provide an heir. Beyond that, you may live exactly as you please, so long as you do not interfere with my business." A transaction. Clean, sterile, brutal. Rowena pulled the ledger toward her. She didn't open it. The sheer weight of the paper was enough to convey the volume of her father's ruin. She thought of Nathaniel. Nathaniel, who had sat in this very garden, weaving dandelion stems around her wrists, promising that love would conquer the rot of her family's name. Nathaniel, who had vanished the moment the creditors arrived, only to surface weeks later engaged to the daughter of a textile baron. Love was a luxury for people who could afford firewood. "Do you have a pen, Your Grace?" she asked. Duane reached inside his heavy wool coat and withdrew a silver fountain pen. He laid it on the table. He was watching her intently now. The indifference in his gray eyes had shifted just marginally into something resembling curiosity. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for the plea, the moral outrage, the hysterics. Rowena uncapped the pen. The metal was still warm from his body heat. She opened the back cover of the ledger, where the marriage contract had already been glued in, heavy with legal seals. She didn't read the clauses. It didn't matter. She was selling herself by the pound. She signed her name, Rowena Margaret Hastings. The ink bled slightly into the thick, cheap paper. She pushed the book back across the table. Done. Duane looked at the signature, then up at her. His jaw tightened. He seemed almost disappointed. "You make a very quiet victim, Lady Rowena." "I am not a victim, Your Grace," she said, standing up. Her knees locked, fighting a wave of dizzying fatigue. "I am a commodity. You have purchased me. Do not expect me to act surprised when you put me to use." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the dust and the echoes. Pins dug into the soft flesh of Rowena's waist. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath through her teeth, as the seamstress yanked the corset laces tighter. "Hold still, my lady. The Duke was very specific about the silhouette," Madame Fournier muttered around a mouthful of brass pins. Silk taffeta cascaded around Rowena's legs, a heavy, suffocating ocean of ivory. The dress weighed entirely too much. It pulled at her shoulders, the heavily beaded bodice pressing down on her chest, like a physical manifestation of the contract she had signed. The air in the fitting room was stifling, thick with the smell of scorched fabric from the pressing irons and the sharp chemical tang of sizing starch. She stared at herself in the cracked floor-length mirror. She looked like a stranger. The hollows of her cheeks were disguised by the sheer volume of the gown, her pale skin contrasting sharply with the aggressive wealth of the fabric. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like an offering on a very expensive altar. The heavy oak door to the parlor creaked open. "Rowena?" The voice hit the back of her neck like a draft. She didn't turn around. She watched Nathaniel's reflection appear in the mirror over her shoulder. He was dressed impeccably, his waistcoat of buttery yellow silk, his cravat tied in a complex knot. He smelled of bergamot and expensive pomade, a sharp contrast to the damp, earthy reality of her life over the past month. "Get out, Nathaniel," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She focused on a small, flawed thread in the lace at her collar. Madame Fournier paused, looking between the two of them with wide, inquisitive eyes. "I will fetch the veil," the seamstress murmured, slipping out the side door with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to aristocratic scandals. Nathaniel stepped closer. The floorboards creaked beneath his polished boots. "Rowena, you cannot do this. Duane Ashford is a monster. He is ruthless in Parliament, and worse to his tenants. He broke a man's jaw in a dispute over a toll road." "He also paid my father's debts," Rowena replied, turning slowly to face him. The dress rustled, a dry, insect-like sound. "Which is more than your poetry and dandelion crowns accomplished." Nathaniel flinched. A satisfying, ugly ripple of pain crossed his handsome face. "I had no choice. My father threatened to cut me off if I married a pauper. You know that. I had to secure my family's future." "And I am securing mine," she said. "We are both whores, Nathaniel. The only difference is that my buyer holds a title, and yours holds a loom." He took another step, reaching out to touch her arm. Rowena shifted her weight, stepping just out of his reach. The movement sent a fresh wave of pinpricks across her ribs. "I love you, Eve," he whispered, using his old pet name for her. It sounded hollow now, cheap. I can find a way. Run away with me. I have access to a carriage. We can go to France. I have some funds." Rowena let out a short, harsh laugh. It scraped against her dry throat. "France? On what, Nathaniel? The allowance your new father-in-law provides. Will you feed me on stolen table scraps? Will we sleep in barns?" She looked at his hands, soft, uncalloused, fingers that had never dug a rotting potato out of the freezing mud. She thought of Dwayne's hands, broad, scarred, grounded in terrible, undeniable reality. "I don't want your romantic poverty, Nathaniel," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I have lived it. It is not noble. It does not make the soul pure. It makes you cold. It makes you hungry. And it makes you cruel." She stepped closer to him. The sheer volume of her skirts forced him to take a step back. "Dwayne Ashford is exactly what he presented himself to be," she said. "A businessman who needed a plot of land. You presented yourself as a savior and fled at the first sign of rain. Do not come into my house and insult my husband." The word tasted strange on her tongue. Husband. Bitter, heavy, but strangely solid. Nathaniel stared at her, his mouth slightly open. He looked as if she had slapped him. "You are cold, Rowena. The rumors are true. You have ice in your veins." "Ice survives the winter," she replied, turning back to the mirror. "Now get out before I have the footman throw you into the street." When the door finally clicked shut behind him, Rowena closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking. She dug her fingernails into the thick taffeta of her skirts until the shaking stopped. She was so tired. She just wanted to sit down, but the corset wouldn't allow it. Madame Fournier slipped back into the room, carrying a cascade of Brussels lace. She didn't say a word about the man who had just left. She simply stepped behind Rowena and began pinning the veil into her hair. The pins scraped aggressively against Rowena's scalp. She didn't flinch. She just stared at her own dark eyes in the mirror, watching the humanity slowly drain out of them, replaced by the necessary polished armor of a duchess. Wax melted in thick, uneven globs down the sides of 1,000 candles, filling the cavernous nave of St. Jude's Cathedral with a heavy, suffocating warmth. The air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of burning beeswax, damp stone, and the collective, nervously sweating bodies of the London elite, packed shoulder to shoulder to witness the merger of two ancient bloodlines. Rowena walked down the aisle. She did not glide. She dragged. The ivory dress, heavily embroidered with pearls and silver thread, felt like chainmail. Every step required a conscious effort of her thighs and calves. The stone floor beneath the thin soles of her slippers was freezing, sending sharp shocks of cold up her legs that warred with the stifling heat of the crowded room. Her father was absent. Passed out in a rented carriage outside, the driver instructed to keep him there until the documents were sealed. Instead, she walked alone. Whispers hissed from the pews like a nest of disturbed vipers. Sold her for a patch of dirt. Utterly ruined. Look at her face, like a ghost. Rowena kept her chin perfectly level. She focused on the altar, specifically on a crack in the marble step just beneath the bishop's feet. If she looked at the crack, she didn't have to look at the man waiting for her. But as she reached the steps, she had no choice. Dwayne stood perfectly still. He wore absolute black, a stark, jarring contrast to the sea of colorful silks and satins in the pews. No medals, no sashes, just the impeccable, terrifying tailoring of mourning clothes. His dark hair was brushed back, his jaw tight. He looked furious. He looked like a man walking to the gallows, not an altar. When she stepped up beside him, he didn't offer a reassuring smile. He simply extended his left hand. Rowena placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, radiating a blistering heat. He closed his fingers over hers. It wasn't a gentle clasp. It was a vice, a physical claim. His thumb pressed hard into the fragile bones of her knuckles, bruising the skin beneath her lace glove. The bishop began to speak. Latin poured from his mouth in a droning, monotonous river. Rowena didn't listen to the words. She listened to the sound of Dwayne's breathing. It was slow, measured, but deep. a predator holding perfectly still. The weight of the crowd pressed against her back. The corset dug into her ribs, restricting her lung capacity to shallow, panic-inducing sips of the incense-choked air. A bead of sweat trickled down her spine beneath the heavy silk. I am going to faint, she thought, a sudden horrifying realization. My knees are going to buckle, and I will collapse on this freezing floor in front of 300 people who want nothing more than to see me fail. She swayed just a fraction of an inch. Dwayne's grip tightened instantly. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed firmly on the bishop, but he pulled her slightly closer, his solid shoulder brushing against hers. He was anchoring her. Not out of kindness, she knew, but out of pride. He would not tolerate the public embarrassment of a swooning bride. "Do you, Dwayne Arthur Ashford, take this woman—" The vows began in English, the harsh, binding words of the law. Dwayne shifted his weight. He turned his head slightly, his mouth hovering just inches from her ear. The scent of clove and bitter tobacco washed over her, overpowering the sickly sweet incense. "You are shaking, Lady Rowena," he murmured, his voice so low it was completely swallowed by the echoes of the cathedral. "I am cold," she lied, her teeth clenched so tightly her jaw ached. "You are terrified," he corrected, his breath hot against her skin. There was a dark, jagged edge of satisfaction in his tone. He was angry. Angry that he had to buy her. Angry that she had accepted. Angry at the entire transactional nature of their existence. And he wanted her to feel that anger. He wanted her to crack. He leaned in closer, his lips almost brushing the lobe of her ear. "You think you can survive me with silence. You cannot. Before this marriage is through, you will beg for mercy." The words were a physical strike. They vibrated in her chest. Rowena stopped swaying. The panic, the exhaustion, the overwhelming urge to collapse. It all evaporated, incinerated by a sudden, violent surge of pure, unadulterated spite. She turned her head to look at him. His gray eyes were mere inches away, storm dark and searching her face for the break, for the tear, for the capitulation. Rowena didn't flinch. She felt the heavy muscles of her own face stretch into a slow, mocking smile. She tasted salt where she had bitten her own lip raw an hour ago. "I have never begged for anything," she whispered back, her voice a rusted blade sliding out of a sheath. "Not for food, not for love, and certainly not for you." Something flared in Dwayne's eyes. The cynical squint vanished, replaced by a raw, startling intensity. The grip on her hand changed. It didn't loosen, but the bruising pressure shifted, his thumb dragging slowly, deliberately across the pulse point on her wrist. His pulse was racing just as fast as hers. The bishop cleared his throat, holding out the gold ring. Dwayne took it. He didn't break eye contact with Rowena as he shoved the heavy gold band onto her finger. It scraped over her knuckle, a cold, permanent shackle. "I pronounce you man and wife." Dwayne turned to her fully. The script required a kiss, a gentle, chaste brush of lips to seal the bargain. Instead, he took her face in both of his rough hands. He tilted her head up, his fingers digging into her jawline, and brought his mouth down hard on hers. There was no tenderness in it. It was dry, bruising, and tasted of bitter wine. It was a warning. It was a challenge. Rowena kept her eyes open the entire time. When he pulled away, his chest heaved once. He turned, grabbing her arm, and began the march back down the aisle. The heavy doors of the cathedral swung open, letting in a blinding shaft of pale afternoon light and the sharp, freezing wind of the London streets. They stepped into the waiting carriage in absolute silence. The door slammed shut, cutting off the noise of the crowd. The carriage lurched forward, the wooden wheels clattering aggressively against the cobblestones. Rowena sat on the plush leather bench, staring at the opposing wall. The gold ring weighed heavily on her left hand. Beside her, Dwayne stared out the window, his jaw tight, his broad shoulders filling half the carriage. The air between them was electric, thick with unsaid wars and silent, jagged edges. She had sold her body and her name. But as she watched the muscle feather in Dwayne's jaw, she realized the true battle had only just begun, and she would rather die than surrender her mind. Gravel crunched beneath the carriage wheels like grinding teeth. Carlisle Hall did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them. Built from severe, unyielding dark stone, the manor sat upon a rising hill, its sheer walls cutting into the bruised purple sky of twilight. There were no sprawling rose gardens, no delicate wrought iron gates. The estate smelled of wet pine, damp soil, and the faint, ever-present bite of sulfur from the valley's distant coal fires. It was a monument to industry, bought and paid for by men who understood the value of iron over aesthetics. The carriage lurched to a halt. Dwayne did not wait for a footman. He kicked the door open himself and stepped out into the biting wind, immediately shrugging off his heavy black morning coat. Beneath it, his white shirt was damp with sweat at the collar. He tossed the expensive coat over his shoulder like a common laborer carrying a sack of flour. He didn't look back to see if Rowena was following. She gripped the leather strap by the door, her fingers numb, and hauled herself out. Her legs, locked in the rigid cage of her skirts and the punishing corset, screamed in protest. She stumbled on the carriage step, the heavy ivory taffeta catching under her heel. Dwayne caught her. His hand clamped around her upper arm with bruising force, hauling her upright before her knees could touch the muddy gravel. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. It was a physical reflex, stabilizing a falling object. For a split second, she was pressed against his side, breathing in the sharp, overwhelming scent of clove, horse sweat, and pure, radiant body heat. "Find your footing," he muttered, dropping her arm the instant she was vertical. "My footing is perfectly fine," she clipped back, adjusting her veil with shaking hands. "My cage is simply too heavy." He gave her a sidelong glance, a dark slash of a look that registered her pale face and tight jaw before turning toward the heavy oak doors. "Harrison!" he bellowed. The doors swung open before they even reached the stone steps. A severe-looking man in a meticulously pressed gray suit stood in the foyer. The interior of the house was aggressively Spartan. High vaulted ceilings stripped of frescoes, dark mahogany wainscoting gleaming with lemon oil, and a floor of polished slate that echoed like a crypt. It smelled of beeswax and roasting meat. Real meat. Rowena's stomach gave a violent, involuntary cramp. "Your Grace," Harrison said, bowing stiffly. He did not look at Rowena. "Tell the mill managers I will review the dredging contracts in the study. Bring whiskey, and tell Mrs. Gable to show my wife to the east wing." Dwayne didn't break stride. He walked straight through the massive foyer, the heels of his boots striking the slate like hammer blows, and disappeared behind a pair of heavy double doors. The lock clicked shut with a definitive metallic snap. Rowena stood alone in the center of the hall, swathed in yards of useless, expensive silk, utterly dismissed. A stout woman in a severe black bombazine dress materialized from a side corridor. She held a ring of heavy iron keys that clattered against her thigh. "If you will follow me, Your Grace," she said. Her tone was perfectly polite and entirely devoid of warmth. The walk to the east wing was an agonizing physical trial. The stairs were steep, designed for men with long strides, not women hobbled by petticoats. By the time Mrs. Gable opened the door to the master suite, Rowena was relying on sheer spite to keep from collapsing. The bedroom was vast and oppressive, deep forest green walls, heavy velvet drapes drawn tight against the night, and a massive four-poster bed dominating the center of the room like an altar. A fire roared in the hearth, but the corners of the room remained stubbornly cold. "I will send up a maid to assist you with your dress," Mrs. Gable said, turning to leave. "No," Rowena said. The words scraped out of her dry throat. "I require no one. Just bring me a knife." "Mrs." Gable paused, her thick eyebrows shooting upward into her hairline. "A knife, Your Grace?" "A small one. From the kitchen." Rowena turned away, walking stiffly toward the fire. "I cannot reach the knots." 10 minutes later, alone in the cavernous room, Rowena stood before a tall cheval mirror. She held a small, sharp paring knife in her right hand. She reached awkwardly over her shoulder, the muscles in her back seizing, and hooked the blade under the thick silk lacing of the corset. She pulled. The thick cord snapped with a sound like a breaking violin string. She cut another, and another. The rigid whalebone shell suddenly gave way. Rowena gasped, a ragged, ugly sound, as her lungs finally expanded to their full capacity. The sudden rush of oxygen made the room spin. She let the heavy beaded bodice fall to the floor, stepping out of the pooling taffeta until she stood only in her thin cotton chemise. She looked at her reflection. The physical cost of the day was painted across her skin. Deep, angry red and purple welts dug horizontally across her ribs and waist. The skin chafed raw from the stiff boning. Her collarbones jutted out sharply against the fragile cotton of her shift, shadows pooling in the hollows of her neck. She looked like a casualty of war. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Rowena quickly pulled on a heavy wool dressing gown she found folded at the foot of the bed, wrapping it tightly around her battered ribs. Enter. A young maid slipped in, carrying a heavy silver tray. The smell hit Rowena instantly. Thick gravy, roasted root vegetables, heavily peppered mutton, and warm, crusty bread. The aroma was so dense it was almost physical. Her mouth watered so violently it ached. "Cook thought you might be hungry, ma'am," the maid whispered, setting the tray on a small table near the fire before fleeing the room as if the carpet were on fire. Rowena walked to the table. She didn't sit down. She picked up a thick slice of bread, her hands shaking, and dipped it directly into the gravy. She shoved it into her mouth. The taste of salt, fat, and rich meat exploded on her tongue. It was overwhelming. She chewed frantically, swallowing past the tight knot in her throat, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She ate like a feral thing, hunched over the tray, ripping the meat apart with her fingers because picking up the heavy silver cutlery felt like too much effort. Survival was a deeply unglamorous thing. Night settled over Carlisle Hall, heavy and absolute. The wind howled against the thick glass of the windows, rattling the leaded panes. Inside, the house was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the eardrums. Rowena sat in a high-backed leather chair facing the dying embers of the fire. She had washed her face in a porcelain basin, scrubbing away the rice powder and the faint, lingering scent of the cathedral incense. She wore her own nightgown, a plain, coarse linen garment mended twice at the hem. It offered no warmth, but she refused to wear the expensive silk nonsense Madame Fournier had packed. The grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. A low, vibrating toll. Footsteps approached, heavy, measured. They stopped outside her door. Rowena stopped breathing. Her fingers dug into the armrests of the chair, the leather squeaking faintly in protest. The contract was a legal document. She had sold the land, the mineral rights, and her body. The terms were explicit. She was expected to provide an heir. She had prepared herself for this, compartmentalizing the impending violation into the same mental ledger where she kept her father's debts. It was simply another cost of doing business. The brass door handle turned slowly. Dwayne stepped into the room. The transition from the harsh light of the hallway to the dim, firelit chamber cast his face into deep shadow. He had discarded the formal wear entirely. He wore dark, rough-spun trousers and a simple white shirt, unbuttoned at the throat. The sleeves rolled up past his forearms. He held a crystal tumbler filled with an inch of amber liquid. He smelled of peat smoke, old paper, and the sharp bite of whiskey. He closed the door behind him. The lock clicked. It sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. He turned and looked at her. He expected to find her in the bed, shivering beneath the heavy-down quilts, waiting in terrified, compliant silence. Instead, he found her sitting upright in the chair, wrapped in coarse linen, staring back at him with eyes as hard and black as flint. Dwayne paused. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He walked toward the fireplace, setting the tumbler on the heavy oak mantelpiece. The heat of the dying embers illuminated the harsh, uncompromising lines of his face and the thin, pale scar near his eye. "You are not in bed," he observed. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "I am not a parcel waiting to be unwrapped," Rowena replied. Her voice was remarkably steady, betraying none of the frantic, fluttering panic in her chest. Dwayne turned his head slightly, studying her. The cynical squint returned. "Do you intend to make this difficult, Lady Rowena? Because I am remarkably tired, and I lack the patience for a theatrical struggle." "I signed the contract," she said coldly. "I intend to fulfill my obligations, but I will not pretend to eagerly await my own ruin for your ego's sake." He stepped closer. The sheer size of him altered the gravity in the room. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the meager light from the fire. Rowena forced herself to remain perfectly still. She would not press back into the chair. She would not shrink. He reached out. Rowena's jaw locked, her teeth grinding together so hard her temples throbbed. She braced for the rough, bruising grip she had felt at the carriage. Instead, his fingertips merely brushed the high collar of her coarse linen nightgown. His skin was rough, calloused, and radiating a startling amount of heat. He didn't pull her up. He didn't force a kiss. His knuckles grazed her collarbone, and he suddenly froze. Rowena watched his brow furrow. The flat, opaque gray of his eyes narrowed. Slowly, deliberately, he hooked his index finger under the collar of her gown and pulled the fabric just an inch to the side, exposing the curve of her shoulder and the top of her ribs. The firelight caught the ugly, mottled purple and angry red welts left by the corset. They looked like the aftermath of a whipping. Dwayne stared at the bruises. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut. He reached out with his other hand, his thumb hovering barely a millimeter over the bruised skin, feeling the heat radiating from the inflammation. He didn't touch it. "Vanity is a violent thing," he murmured, his voice dropping into a harsh, uneven register. "Necessity," Rowena corrected, staring straight ahead at the buttons of his shirt. "You required a specific silhouette for the public. I provided it." Dwayne dropped his hand, letting the collar slip back into place. He looked down at her hands, which were folded rigidly in her lap. He reached down and took her right hand. Again, he didn't squeeze. He turned her palm upward, running his callous thumb over the pads of her fingers and the rough, hardened skin at the base of her palm. The friction of his calluses against hers made a soft, dry sound. A spark of genuine, deeply unsettled confusion crossed his face. He looked from her ruined hands to her face. "Hastings never mentioned you worked the dirt. My father hasn't noticed me since I was 12, she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Why would he notice who pulls the weeds, chops the firewood, or scrubs the floors when the servants quit? Did you think you were buying a porcelain doll, Your Grace? I apologize if the merchandise is damaged." Dwayne let go of her hand as if he had been burned. He took a sharp step back, the muscle in his jaw jumping violently. He walked back to the mantelpiece, picked up his whiskey, and downed the remainder in a single brutal swallow. He set the glass down with a heavy thwack against the wood. He turned to face the fire, resting his forearm on the mantel, his back to her. "The contract requires an heir," he said to the flames. The words were clipped, tight. "I am aware." Dwayne let out a breath that sounded like a harsh laugh. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. The hardened, ruthless businessman was completely gone, replaced by a man staring at a deeply uncomfortable reality. "You are malnourished," he stated flatly. The words hit the air like stones. "Your bones are protruding, and your hands look like they belong to a navvy. If I bed you tonight, and you conceive, you will likely die in childbirth before the winter is out." Rowena felt a flush of pure, burning humiliation crawl up her neck. He was dissecting her physical failures. He was looking at her poverty, at her starvation, and calling it a logistical liability. "And I," Dwayne continued, turning fully to face her, his eyes cold and pragmatic once more, "will be forced to find another wife. I do not have the time to court again. I have a mill to run." It was an incredibly callous thing to say, wrapped in a strange, brutal pragmatism. It was an insult, and it was a stay of execution. Rowena stared at him, her chest tight, her pride bleeding out onto the floor. "Are you rejecting your purchase, Your Grace?" Dwayne walked toward the door. He didn't offer a polite farewell. He didn't attempt to soften the blow. He stopped with his hand on the brass knob and looked back at her, his expression utterly unreadable. Eat the food my kitchen provides. Sleep. Put some flesh on your bones. He turned the knob. I do not sleep with ghosts, Lady Rowena. It is bad for morale. The door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place, sealing her inside. Rowena sat in the chair for a long time, staring at the closed door, hating him, not because he was cruel, but because his cruelty was the only thing that had offered her mercy. Morning slipped into the east wing through a narrow gap in the velvet curtains, casting a sharp blade of gray light across the heavy mahogany floorboards. Rowena woke with a violent jolt, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a fraction of a second, she braced for the freezing damp of her old room, waiting for the wind to whistle through the cracked plaster. Instead, she felt the oppressive, suffocating weight of a goose-down quilt and the lingering warmth of a dying fire. She sat up. Her stomach gave a low, hollow throb. A silver tray sat on the small table by the window, left by a maid who must have crept in like a ghost. Rowena threw off the heavy quilt and walked barefoot across the thick Turkish rug. The carpet fibers felt alien against her soles. Too soft, too yielding. She lifted the silver dome. Slices of thick-cut bacon swam in grease beside a mound of scrambled eggs bright with expensive butter. A small pot of jam, 3 kinds of bread, and a steaming porcelain cup of black tea. It was a feast designed for a laboring man, entirely absurd for a woman confined to a bedroom. Dwayne's order. Put some flesh on your bones. Rowena picked up a piece of bacon. Her mouth watered so aggressively it stung her jaw. She ate it quickly, the salt and fat coating her tongue. She reached for the eggs, but stopped. Her stomach, shrunken by months of watery broth and stale crusts, twisted in warning. Rich food was a luxury. Digesting it was a violence. She forced herself to eat half the eggs, chewing slowly, taking tiny sips of the bitter tea to cut the grease. When she could stomach no more, she looked at the remaining bread, a thick, crusty roll. Instinct, honed by 3 years of desperate poverty, hijacked her manners. She grabbed a linen napkin, wrapped the roll inside, and walked to the heavy oak wardrobe. She opened the bottom drawer, burying the stolen bread beneath a pile of unused, absurdly expensive silk stockings. Survival was a habit that did not vanish with a gold ring. She dressed herself, completely ignoring the complicated gowns Madame Fournier had packed. She found her own worn, gray wool day dress, the one with the meticulously darned cuffs, and dragged it over her head, managing the simple bone buttons down the front without a maid. It hung looser than it had a month ago. Rowena left the room and navigated the cavernous, echoing halls of Carlisle Hall. She did not seek out the parlor or the library. She sought the pulse of the house. The kitchens were located in the basement, a sprawling cavern of stone and iron that smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and yeasty dough. When Rowena pushed open the heavy swinging door, the bustling noise of a dozen servants instantly died. A copper pot clattered onto a counter. Someone gasped. Aristocratic wives did not venture into the scullery. Mrs. Gable, the severe housekeeper, stepped forward, wiping flour from her thick hands onto her apron. "Your Grace, you should not be down here. The heat?" "The heat is preferable to the draft upstairs," Rowena interrupted, her voice flat, carrying easily over the hiss of a boiling kettle. She walked toward the massive central work table. A young kitchen boy was violently scraping a wooden cutting board, sweeping scraps of fat and gristle into a tin bucket. Rowena pointed at the bucket. "What is that?" Mrs. Gable frowned, clearly affronted. "Refuse, Your Grace, for the pigs." "Half of that is perfectly good sweet," Rowena stated. She didn't sound angry. She sounded infinitely tired. "Render it down. It can be used for sealing the winter preserves or making soap. Throwing it to the pigs is a waste of a shilling a week." Silence descended on the kitchen, heavy and stunned. Rowena turned her attention to the massive slate board on the wall where the day's deliveries were chalked in cramped handwriting. She read the numbers. 2 tons of anthracite coal delivered yesterday. We have 30 fireplaces in this house, burning perhaps half a scuttle a day at current temperatures. That is 15 scuttles. Why are we purchasing 2 tons a week? Harrison, the severe footman, had just entered through the back corridor. He froze, his polished shoes squeaking softly on the stone floor. The house is large, Your Grace. The damp... I chopped my own firewood for 3 years, Harrison, Rowena said, turning to face him. Her dark eyes locked onto his, completely devoid of the polite, vapid ignorance expected of a duchess. I know precisely how many scuttles a cord yields, and I know exactly how fast anthracite burns. Someone is skimming the coal pile and selling it in the village. Harrison's face went completely bloodless. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. I do not care what happened before I arrived, Rowena continued, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. But I manage the servants now. That is my side of the contract. The skimming stops today. If the ledgers do not match the coal chute by Friday, I will not fire you. I will simply have the Duke deduct the difference from your wages. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, the heavy door swinging shut behind her. As she climbed the stone stairs back to the main floor, a shadow detached itself from the alcove near the landing. Dwayne stood there. He wore his heavy riding coat, his boots caked in fresh yellow mud. He smelled of horse sweat, damp earth, and bitter tobacco. He had been standing there long enough to hear the entire exchange. Rowena stopped, her hand gripping the wooden banister. She waited for the reprimand. She had overstepped, usurped his authority, acted entirely unduchess-like. Dwayne didn't yell. He didn't even frown. He looked at her gray wool dress, at her stark, unpowdered face, and finally, down at the knuckles of her right hand, where a fresh blister had formed from gripping the banister too tightly. Soap, he said. The word was a gravelly rumble. Pardon? Rowena asked, her guard instantly rising. You told them to render the fat for soap. A strange, sharp gleam flickered in his flat gray eyes. It wasn't quite amusement. It was something heavier. My mother used to say the exact same thing. He didn't offer another word. He simply walked past her, his broad shoulder brushing the fabric of her sleeve, leaving a faint streak of dried mud on the gray wool. Rowena stood on the stairs, staring at his retreating back, a strange, uncomfortable knot tightening in her chest. He hadn't mocked her poverty. He had recognized it. Steam coated the windows of the carriage, condensation dripping down the glass in jagged, erratic trails. Rowena sat rigidly on the leather bench, ignoring the violent shaking of the cab as it navigated the deeply rutted, unpaved road leading into the Hastings Valley. Her valley. Or rather, it used to be. She had been at Carlisle Hall for 2 weeks. She had forced down the heavy meals, hoarded bread in her wardrobe, and brought a terrifying, brutal efficiency to the household ledgers. The staff moved around her with fearful, absolute respect. But she had not seen her husband since the incident on the stairs. He left before dawn and returned long after she retreated to her room, a phantom of industry haunting the edges of her existence. Today, she intended to find him. The carriage lurched to a halt. The driver shouted something indistinct over a deafening mechanical roar. Rowena pushed open the door and stepped out into a nightmare. The valley she remembered, a quiet, overgrown expanse of weeping willows and marshland, was gone. In its place was a massive, violently active scar in the earth. Hundreds of men swarmed over wooden scaffolding like ants on a carcass. Deep trenches had been gouged into the mud, lined with heavy timber. At the center of it all, a monstrous steam engine squatted on a concrete plinth, belching thick, sulphurous black smoke into the pale sky. The noise was a physical assault, grinding iron, the hiss of pressurized steam, and the rhythmic, bone-rattling thud of a pile driver driving logs into the riverbed. Rowena tasted coal dust on her tongue. It was bitter, metallic, and sharp. She began walking down the steep embankment. Her leather half-boots sank instantly into the thick, sucking yellow mud, ruining the leather within 3 steps. She didn't care. She hiked her gray wool skirt up with one hand, ignoring the splatters of filth coating her ankles, her eyes scanning the organized chaos. She found him near the river's edge. Dwayne stood knee-deep in a trench, unrolling a large canvas schematic across a muddy wooden barrel. He wore no coat, no waistcoat, and no cravat. His white shirt was soaked gray with sweat and stained with axle grease, the sleeves rolled up to expose thick, heavily corded forearms. He was arguing violently with a man in a bowler hat, his voice cutting through the mechanical din with the sheer force of its baritone edge. He looked dangerous, entirely in his element, a predator managing a mechanical beast. Rowena walked straight toward the trench. A worker carrying a massive sack of cement nearly collided with her, shouting a crude warning before freezing in absolute terror upon realizing he had nearly crushed a lady in a silk-lined hat. Dwayne heard the man's shout. He snapped his head up. When he saw Rowena standing at the edge of the trench, the mud caking her hem, his expression darkened into immediate furious thunder. He vaulted out of the trench, his heavy boots landing on the wet earth with a sickening squelch. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a greeting. He grabbed her left elbow, his large hand completely engulfing her arm, and physically dragged her backward, away from the swing radius of a nearby timber crane. "What in the name of God are you doing here?" He roared over the hiss of the steam engine. His face was streaked with soot, making his pale scar stand out in stark, jagged relief. The smell of him, pure, unfiltered adrenaline, ozone, and sulfur, was overwhelming. Rowena yanked her arm out of his grip. She refused to rub the spot where his fingers had dug in. "I came to see what you were doing to my land." "It is not your land anymore," he snapped, his chest heaving. "It is a construction site. It is dangerous. It is filthy, and it is no place for a woman in a glass cage." "I am not in a glass cage, Your Grace. I am in the mud, same as you." Rowena pointed a finger toward the eastern bank of the river, where a massive earthen dam was being erected. "And if you do not reinforce that limestone shelf beneath the secondary embankment, your entire mill foundation is going to slide into the river the first time it rains heavily." Dwayne stopped. The fury in his eyes halted, instantly replaced by a sharp, calculating, dissecting gaze. He looked at the bank, then back at her. "The surveyor certified the bedrock. The surveyor didn't dig potatoes out of that specific patch of dirt for 3 autumns," Rowena shot back, her voice ringing clear and hard over the industrial noise. "That soil isn't sitting on bedrock. It's sitting on compressed shale. It holds water like a sponge. The moment you flood the upper lock, the hydrostatic pressure will turn that entire bank into pudding." Dwayne stared at her. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. She met his stare head-on, her chin raised, her breath pluming in the cold air. He looked down at her hands. She wasn't wearing gloves. The blisters from the garden were healing, leaving thick, ugly calluses behind. Proof. Slowly, Dwayne reached up and wiped a streak of grease from his jaw with the back of his hand. The aggressive, domineering posture vanished. He looked at the eastern bank again, his eyes narrowing as he traced the natural curve of the land against the violent straight lines of his construction. He turned back to her. The tension between them hadn't evaporated. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer the spiteful resentment of a forced marriage. It was the sudden, jarring friction of 2 sharpened blades striking against one another. "Show me," Dwayne commanded. He didn't offer his arm. He simply turned and began walking toward the unstable embankment, trusting her to follow. Rowena let her skirts drop fully into the mud, a heavy, filthy weight dragging at her legs, and marched right behind him into the maw of the machine. Yellow mud swallowed her boots whole with every step, the earth trying to drag her down into the trench. Rowena did not stumble. She used her ruined leather soles to cut hard angles into the slick embankment, navigating the chaotic construction site with the grim certainty of a woman who had spent years fighting this exact soil. Dwayne followed, his massive frame radiating an almost suffocating heat. He didn't speak. He just watched the way she moved, his gray eyes tracking the calculated placement of her feet. They reached the eastern perimeter. A 30-foot wall of earth and timber was half-built, designed to hold back the river once the locks were closed. The noise here was slightly muted, drowned out by the rushing water of the river itself. Rowena stopped and pointed to a jagged, exposed section of the bank near the waterline. There, beneath the yellow clay. Look at the color. Dwayne stepped past her. He didn't bother calling for a worker. He bent down, plunging his bare hands directly into the freezing, viscous mud. His thick muscles corded against his forearms as he tore a massive chunk of the clay away from the bank. He tossed it aside. Beneath it lay a band of dark, greasy stone. It wasn't solid. It was flaky, layered like a rotting pastry, and it was actively weeping dark water. He dug his fingernails into the stone. It crumbled instantly into wet, gritty sand. "Shale," Dwayne murmured, his baritone voice barely carrying over the rushing river. He crushed the wet stone in his fist. Water squeezed out between his knuckles, dripping steadily into the mud. "It runs the entire length of the eastern ridge," Rowena said, standing firmly beside him, ignoring the freezing wind biting through her thin wool dress. "In the dry season, it feels like bedrock, but when the autumn storms hit, the water table rises. That shale turns into a subterranean slip and slide. My father tried to build a stone folly on this exact ridge 10 years ago. It collapsed in a week, took 3 prized hounds with it." Dwayne slowly stood up. He wiped his filthy hands on his ruined trousers, smearing the dark, oily residue of the shale across his thighs. He stared at the massive earthen dam towering above them, then looked down at the crumbling rock at his feet. The math was playing out behind his opaque gray eyes. The sheer volume of water, the hydrostatic pressure, the inevitable catastrophic failure that would have wiped out 100,000 pounds of investment and likely drowned half his workforce. He turned his head and looked at her. There was no anger left in him. The cynical, dominating edge that he wore like armor had completely fractured. He stared at her pale face, her wind-whipped hair, and the dark, heavy mud coating the hem of her cheap gray dress. She was shivering, a fine, involuntary tremor rattling her jaw, but she held his gaze without flinching. "Harrison told me you were in the kitchen this morning," he said slowly, the words rough, catching in his throat, "arguing over the price of rendered fat and coal scuttles." "I was securing my end of the contract," Rowena replied, her voice tight with the cold. "You bought a manager for your household. I manage." Dwayne closed the distance between them. He stopped mere inches away. The smell of him, sulfur, ozone, and dark, bitter sweat enveloped her, blocking out the biting wind. He reached out. Rowena's breath hitched, expecting him to grab her arm again. Instead, he unfastened the top button of his heavy wool riding coat. He stripped it off, his broad shoulders shifting under his sweat-soaked shirt, and draped the massive garment over her shoulders. The coat weighed at least 10 pounds. It smelled intensely of clove and tobacco, and the lining was radiating a blistering, furious body heat. "Put your arms through the sleeves," he commanded softly. Rowena hesitated, her pride warring with the bone-deep chill. The shivering won. She slid her arms into the cavernous sleeves. The cuffs hung past her fingertips. Dwayne reached forward, his calloused, mud-stained fingers brushing against her throat as he pulled the heavy lapels together to block the wind. He didn't pull away immediately. His knuckles lingered against her collarbone. The friction of his rough skin against the fine wool of her dress sent a sharp, involuntary shock down her spine. "You did not secure your end of the contract today, Rowena," he said, his voice dropping into a ragged whisper that the wind tried to steal. "You just bought my entire empire." He turned away before she could formulate a response, his boots heavy in the mud. "Foreman?" He roared, his voice suddenly echoing like a cannon shot across the valley. "Halt the eastern line! Bring the timber cranes down! We have a breach in the foundation!" Rowena stood in the mud, drowning in the heavy scent of clove and horse sweat, watching the monster of industry dismantle his own machine because she had told him the earth would not hold. Soot floated on the surface of the bathwater, tiny black islands breaking apart in the soap bubbles. Rowena sat in the copper tub in the center of her bedroom, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She had scrubbed her skin until it was raw, using harsh lye soap to strip the greasy shale and yellow mud from her pores. The water was tepid now, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her muscles ached with a dull, throbbing intensity. The adrenaline of the valley had burned off, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. She stood up, shivering violently as the cold air hit her wet skin. She dried herself roughly with a linen towel and pulled on her coarse, mended nightgown. She didn't brush her hair. It hung down her back in damp, heavy tangles. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 1. Rowena walked to the door. She didn't hesitate. She turned the brass handle and stepped out into the freezing, echoing corridor. She didn't walk toward the stairs. She walked toward the west wing, toward his rooms. The door to Dwayne's study was ajar. A line of thick, buttery yellow light spilled out onto the polished slate floor. She pushed the door open. Dwayne sat behind a massive mahogany desk, buried beneath an avalanche of schematics, ledgers, and architectural drawings. The fire in the hearth was roaring, casting dancing, erratic shadows against the dark wainscoting. He had bathed. He wore a clean white shirt, open at the collar, and dark trousers. His dark hair was still wet, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. He held a crystal tumbler of whiskey in one hand and a heavy red pencil in the other, violently crossing out sections of a blueprint. He heard the door hinge groan. He looked up. When he saw her standing in the doorway, barefoot, wrapped in cheap linen, he dropped the red pencil. It rolled across the blueprints and fell to the floor with a sharp clack. Rowena walked into the room. The Turkish rug felt coarse against the soles of her feet. She stopped at the edge of his desk. "The coal ledgers are balanced," she said, her voice completely stripped of any inflection. It was a raw, factual statement. "Harrison has agreed to a 20% deduction in his wages to repay the deficit. The kitchen staff is rendering the suite." Dwayne stared at her. His flat gray eyes tracked the damp strands of hair clinging to her neck, the sharp jut of her collarbones above the linen collar, and the rigid, unyielding set of her jaw. He set the whiskey down. "I am aware," he said quietly. "Mrs. Gable informed me before I retired. You are terrifyingly efficient, Lady Rowena." "I am a commodity," she corrected, taking a step around the desk. "You purchased efficiency. You purchased land. And today, I protected your investment." Dwayne's jaw tightened. He turned his chair slightly to face her. "You did more than protect it. You salvaged it. I would have lost everything." Rowena stopped mere inches from his knees. The heat radiating from his large frame rivaled the roaring fire. She looked down at him. "Then the debt is settled. The land is yours. The mill will stand. My father's ruin has been paid for in shale and rendered fat." "It is settled," he agreed, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "There is only one clause left in the contract, Your Grace," Rowena said. Her heart was beating so violently it felt like a trapped bird battering against her bruised ribs. She didn't look away. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, to let him see the stark, absolute reality of what they were doing. Dwayne went perfectly still. He looked at her battered hands hanging loosely at her sides. He looked at the faint, fading purple shadows of the corset bruises peeking above her collar. He remembered the night he had walked out of her room, disgusted by the sheer mechanical brutality of what he had bought. "I told you," he murmured, leaning back slowly in his chair, though his muscles were coiled like tight steel springs. "I do not sleep with ghosts, and you are exhausted." "I am not a ghost," Rowena said. She closed the final inch between them, her knees brushing against the rough wool of his trousers. "I am the dirt you are building your empire on. I am the flaw in your bedrock, and I am tired of waiting for the axe to fall." Dwayne let out a ragged breath. The control he had maintained all day snapped. He reached out, his massive hands gripping her waist. He didn't pull her down onto his lap. He stood up, towering over her, his hands sliding up her ribs, mapping the fading bruises with a startling, painful gentleness. He backed her slowly against the heavy edge of the mahogany desk. Rowena gasped as the hard wood dug into her lower back. Dwayne trapped her there, his arms resting on the desk on either side of her hips. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The smell of clove, whiskey, and lye soap was intoxicating. At the altar, Dwayne whispered, his voice dark and ragged. I told you that you would beg for mercy. I remember, Rowena breathed, her hands coming up to rest flat against his chest. She could feel the heavy, frantic thud of his heart beneath the crisp cotton of his shirt. And I told you I have never begged for anything. Dwayne's eyes searched hers. The cynical armor was gone. The ruthless industrialist was gone. What remained was a man staring at a woman who had matched him, scar for scar, in the mud. You won't have to, he murmured, his thumb brushing the sensitive skin just below her ear. Because I am the one begging, Rowena. Yield to me, not because of a ledger, not because of a contract. Yield because you want the fire. Rowena looked at his mouth, then up into his slate-gray eyes. The contradictions within her, the hatred of her situation, the pride of her survival, the sudden terrifying craving for his heat, shattered. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She dug her fingers into his hair and pulled his mouth down to hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision. Dwayne groaned, a low, guttural sound, his arms wrapping around her back and crushing her against his chest. He tasted like burning peat and rich whiskey. Rowena kissed him back with a fierce, desperate hunger, pouring every ounce of her frustration, her starvation, and her survival into the friction of their mouths. He lifted her effortlessly, sitting her on the edge of the mahogany desk, scattering the blueprints and architectural drawings to the floor. The heavy red pencil snapped under his boot. He kissed her jaw, his rough cheek scraping against her skin, his large hands anchoring her to him, as if he were afraid she would dissolve back into the freezing mist. There was no grace in it. It was clumsy, heated, and profoundly human. They were two jagged stones grinding against one another, finding a perfect, interlocking fit in their shared imperfections. Rowena dragged her hands across his broad shoulders, feeling the tension bleed out of him, replaced by a raw, consuming devotion. The contract had demanded a transaction. They forged an alliance instead, built on the heavy, undeniable truth of the earth, and sealed in the consuming mercy of the fire. Did this grounded, enemies-to-lovers historical drama keep you on the edge of your seat? If you crave raw emotions, fierce protagonists, and romance built on mutual respect rather than empty cliches, smash that like button, share this story with your friends who love a fiercely independent heroine, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply human, immersive audio stories. What was your favorite moment between Rowena and Dwayne? Let us know in the comments below.